The wind cuts through the parking lot outside the county courthouse. But the cold I feel has nothing to do with January in Ohio. It has everything to do with the woman I was supposed to marry in 11 days. Rosalind, my radiant 58-year-old fiancée, had begged me never to reach out to her brother. She said he was a violent, unstable man who'd terrorized her for 30 years and would ruin our wedding if he ever found out where she lived. But I'm a man who spent his whole life believing families should be whole. So I tracked down his address myself, expecting to find a rundown trailer with a criminal record posted on every door. Instead, I'm standing in front of a modest brick duplex with a wheelchair ramp built onto the porch and a hand-painted sign that reads, "Welcome home, Danny," hanging in the window. Before I tell you what I found inside that house and the truth that nearly cost me everything, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, folks. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever had to trust your gut when someone you loved was lying straight to your face. Let me take you back to where this all started so you understand how a man like me ended up standing on that cold porch. I spent 38 years as a claims investigator for one of the largest insurance companies in the Midwest. My whole career was built on smelling out the lie underneath the story. I chased staged car accidents, fabricated house fires, workers who claimed crippling injuries while coaching Little League on the weekends. I made a good, quiet living doing it, and I built up a solid nest egg along the way. When I retired 6 years ago, I didn't buy a boat or a cabin up north. I bought a comfortable 4-bedroom house in a peaceful subdivision outside Columbus, and I settled into a simple rhythm of woodworking, church on Sundays, and coaching youth baseball in the spring. I was content, but the house echoed. My wife Carol had passed from ovarian cancer 8 years back. And even after all that time, some nights the silence in that house felt like its own kind of weather. Then I met Rosalind at a fundraising dinner for the Children's Hospital. She was 58, sharp-witted, and carried herself like a woman who'd built her own life brick by brick. She told me she ran a small event planning business out of her home, and she had the polish to prove it: tailored blazers, a leased sedan she kept spotless, and an easy confidence that told me she didn't need anybody's money. She always grabbed the check before I could reach my wallet. For a man who'd spent decades sniffing out red flags for a living, Rosalind didn't trip a single wire. We fell into an easy routine: Sunday brunches, long drives out to the wineries near Hocking Hills, evenings spent planning trips we hadn't taken yet. I thought I'd been given a second chance at happiness I never expected to get again. I never once flaunted what I had, and she never once asked. I told her I was comfortable in retirement, and she seemed perfectly happy, leaving it at that. She made me feel like a young man again, like my chest had been unlocked after years of being sealed shut. I trusted her completely, which for a man who spent his whole career distrusting people professionally was something close to a miracle. After 8 months of courtship, I got down on one knee at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date and asked her to marry me. I'd picked out a ring that was tasteful, not showy, a half-carat solitaire in a simple gold band. When she said yes, she cried into my shoulder and told me I was the safest she'd ever felt in her life. But the moment that ring went on her finger, something in the air between us started to shift, quiet as a change in barometric pressure. I'd pictured something small, 40 or 50 people, maybe a backyard ceremony with string lights and a caterer from town. Rosalind had a different vision entirely. Suddenly, the woman who split every dinner bill down to the penny wanted 250 guests, a ballroom downtown, a live orchestra, a photographer flown in from Chicago. The number she quoted me for the whole affair nearly knocked the wind out of me. I'm not a stingy man, but 4 decades of watching people inflate numbers for a payout had trained something deep in my gut to flinch. I tried gently steering her towards something smaller, suggesting we put that money toward a honeymoon in Portugal or into her business instead. But she got emotional every time, telling me this was the wedding she'd never had, that she deserved one beautiful day after a lifetime of struggling on her own. I loved her, so I folded. Then came the crisis that started it all. On a rainy Thursday evening, Rosalind showed up at my door, soaked and shaking, mascara running down her cheeks, clutching a folder of paperwork. She told me her business checking account had been frozen because of a billing dispute with a former client who'd falsely accused her of fraud, and that 3 of our wedding vendors were threatening to cancel unless deposits landed by Monday. She asked, voice cracking, if I could add her name temporarily to one of my accounts so she could move money directly and settle the vendors while the bank sorted out the dispute. She looked so humiliated to even be asking. Something in my chest ached watching her fall apart like that. Against every instinct my career had ever hammered into me, I said yes. I opened a joint checking account, funded it generously for the wedding, and gave her full access. Once that manufactured emergency had supposedly passed, wedding planning rolled forward again. One evening, sitting at my kitchen table finalizing the guest list, I noticed something missing. Rosalind had listed cousins, sorority sisters, co-workers from a decade back, but there was no brother anywhere on that list. I brought it up carefully. I asked if we should invite Danny, told her I'd love to finally meet him, maybe take him to dinner and introduce myself properly as the man marrying his sister. Rosalind's whole demeanor changed in an instant. The warm, easy woman I knew vanished, replaced by someone rigid and cornered. She stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped, her face flushing red, her voice shaking with something between fury and panic. She told me I had no idea what I was talking about. She painted a picture of Danny as a violent alcoholic who'd put his fists through walls, who'd terrorized her throughout her childhood and stole from their dying mother before disappearing for years. She said if he ever found out where she was, if he ever showed his face at our wedding, she would call the whole thing off on the spot. She paced the kitchen, sobbing, gasping for air between words. Watching her unravel like that, I felt sick for ever bringing it up. I held her, apologized for pushing, and promised I'd never mention her brother again. I made her tea, rubbed her back until her breathing slowed, told her she was safe with me. I'd bought myself peace in the house again, but that peace was about to be tested by a single envelope. A few days later, Rosalind asked me to sort through a stack of forwarded mail that had piled up after she officially moved in with me. She was out at a cake tasting, so I sat at the table sorting catalogs and credit card offers into the trash. And then I saw it. A thick manila envelope with a red urgent stamp across the front. It was a notice from a Medicaid recovery office, addressed not to Rosalind, but to a Daniel Whitfield. My fiancé's maiden name was Whitfield. I sat there staring at that name, my future brother-in-law, the supposedly dangerous drunk who'd vanished off the face of the earth. My thumb ran along the edge of the envelope. I should have set it aside and walked away. But I looked at the return address. According to everything Rosalind had told me, her brother had disappeared into homelessness or prison years ago, cut off from the family entirely. The address on this notice was a residential care facility 2 counties over, a place I vaguely recognized as an assisted living and rehabilitation center for adults with disabilities. My claims investigator instincts, dormant for 6 quiet years, snapped awake all at once. The story didn't square with the paperwork. The back of my neck started to prickle, the exact feeling I used to get right before I cracked open a fraudulent claim worth 6 figures. I folded the letter and slid it into my jacket pocket. I loved Rosalind, but I needed the truth. I had to see this facility with my own eyes. The cold morning air hit me like a slap the second I stepped outside my front door. I pulled my coat tighter, the yellow envelope burning a hole in my pocket. My truck sat in the driveway, the same dependable pickup that had carried me through 6 peaceful years of retirement. I climbed in, turned the key, and felt a heavy knot settle into my stomach. The heater roared to life, but the chill inside the cab had nothing to do with the temperature outside. It was the particular cold that comes over a man realizing the ground he's been standing on might be entirely hollow. I pulled out of my quiet, tree-lined subdivision, leaving behind the trimmed hedges and freshly salted sidewalks, and merged onto the highway, heading toward the address on that envelope. Rosalind had a hair appointment and a dress fitting that would keep her busy for at least 4 hours. I had all the time in the world to find this facility, confirm her brother was exactly the monster she described, and prove my paranoid old instincts wrong. God, I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to pull up to some grim halfway house, see a man with prison tattoos and a scowl, and know Rosalind had told me the truth about every terrible thing. But 38 years of chasing fraudulent claims had taught me one unshakable truth. Paperwork doesn't lie, and people always do. As I drove, my mind wandered back to conference rooms from another life, sitting across from men in cheap suits who swore up and down they'd never faked an injury, right up until the surveillance footage played on the screen behind me. I knew how to read a lie in someone's shoulders before it ever left their mouth. Rosalind had that same effortless, radiant charm. She'd made me feel chosen, needed, young again. She'd slipped past every defense I'd built over a lifetime because I wanted so badly to believe in her. But that envelope in my pocket was a ledger, and ledgers whisper a very different story than the one people tell out loud. The scenery outside my window began to shift, matching the dread pooling low in my chest. The boutique storefronts and manicured lawns of my side of the county thinned out, replaced by strip malls with half their signs, dark, discount pharmacies, and tired-looking diners. The smooth highway pavement gave way to potholes and cracked shoulders. I was driving into a part of the county that had been forgotten a long time ago. None of it made a bit of sense. If Danny Whitfield was the violent predator Rosalind described, a man who'd stolen from their dying mother and vanished into a life of crime, why was his mail coming from a licensed care facility instead of a prison or a gutter somewhere? I turned down a long gravel drive lined with bare, skeletal oak trees, following the GPS toward Willowbrook Residential Care. The building came into view slowly, a squat, single-story brick structure with a wheelchair ramp zigzagging up to the front entrance and a faded mural of a sunrise painted along one wall. It didn't look like a den for a violent alcoholic. It looked like exactly what the letterhead said it was: assisted living for adults who needed extra care. My pulse hammered as I parked and walked up that ramp, the frozen gravel crunching under my boots. I knocked, and a heavy-set nurse in blue scrubs answered, looking at me with polite confusion. I told her I was hoping to see Daniel Whitfield, that I was engaged to his sister. Her expression softened into something like pity. She told me Danny had lived there for almost 4 years, ever since a car accident left him with a traumatic brain injury and partial paralysis on his left side. She said his sister used to visit every single week, without fail, right up until about 14 months ago, when the visits stopped completely and the facility's monthly bills stopped getting paid. I stood frozen in that doorway, the cold air burning in my lungs. 14 months ago was almost exactly when Rosalind and I had started getting serious, right around the time she moved in with me. The nurse, sensing something was terribly wrong, invited me inside. She led me down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, into a small common room where a man sat in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket over his lap, watching a muted television. He turned when he heard footsteps, and even with the left side of his face slack from the injury, I could see Rosalind in his eyes immediately. Same sharp cheekbones, same startled, searching look. He asked if I was from the billing office. He asked if they were going to make him leave. His voice trembled with the exact same fear I'd once seen on the face of an elderly widow whose son had drained her retirement account down to nothing. This wasn't a monster. This was a frightened, disabled man who'd been abandoned by the one person who was supposed to love him unconditionally. The nurse pulled me aside and told me the rest, her voice low and careful. Danny had been receiving a modest but steady settlement from the trucking company responsible for his accident, paid out in structured monthly installments meant to cover his care for the rest of his life. Rosalind had been listed as his power of attorney since their mother passed away. For years, she'd managed those funds responsibly, paying his facility bills on time, buying him a better wheelchair, even a specialized tablet so he could still paint using his good hand. But over the past year, the payments to Willowbrook had slowed, then stopped entirely. The facility had sent letter after letter. Danny's monthly allowance for small comforts, toiletries, snacks from the vending machine had dried up completely. He'd started selling his own paintings to other residents' families just to buy shampoo. I sat down across from Danny in that quiet common room, and for the first time in 14 months, someone from his own family looked him in the eye and told him the truth was about to change. I told him I didn't know the full story yet, but I intended to find out every last piece of it, and that no matter what, he was not going to be forgotten again. He started crying, the kind of crying that comes from a place far too deep and far too old to have a simple name. He told me Rosalind used to be different, that after their mother died, she'd started talking about finally living the life we deserved, about resenting every dollar that went toward his care instead of into her own pocket. He said the last time she visited, she told him she'd met a wonderful man, a retired investigator with a nice house and a healthy retirement fund, and that she finally had a real shot at the life she'd always wanted. I drove home in silence, the heater blasting uselessly against a cold that had settled somewhere much deeper than my skin. Every warm memory of the past year rearranged itself in my mind, recontextualized into something calculated and cold. The joint bank account, the runaway wedding budget, the explosive, theatrical outburst, the one time I'd tried to bring her family into our life. It wasn't grief driving that reaction. It was fear of exposure. I spent the drive making calls, first to an old friend still working fraud investigations at the county prosecutor's office, then to an elder and dependent adult abuse hotline I remembered from a case decades back. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had a plan taking shape, methodical and quiet, the same way I used to build a case file one document at a time until the walls closed in completely. Over the following 2 weeks, I became the investigator I used to be. I pulled bank statements Rosalind didn't know I still had access to as a joint account holder. I found the transfers, Dozens of them, small enough not to draw attention individually, siphoned out of an account meant to protect her disabled brother's care and settlement funds. Designer boutiques, a luxury car lease, a $4,000 deposit to the very ballroom she'd insisted we book for our wedding. I quietly contacted an elder abuse attorney and laid out every document. I contacted the trucking company's settlement administrators and Danny's court-appointed guardian ad litem from years back, now retired but still sharp as a tack, and helped them understand exactly what had been happening under Rosalind's management. I never said a word to Rosalind. I smiled through cake tastings and seating charts, playing the doting fiancé while quietly building a case with the same discipline I'd used for 38 years. The morning of our wedding, the ballroom downtown glittered with white orchids and candlelight, 250 guests dressed in their finest, a live orchestra warming up in the corner. Rosalind looked stunning in her designer gown, radiant and triumphant, greeting guests like a woman who'd finally arrived exactly where she believed she belonged. I stood at the altar and watched her walk toward me down that aisle. And for one small, aching moment, I let myself feel the ghost of the love I thought we'd had. Then, right as the officiant asked if anyone objected to this union, the ballroom doors opened and two detectives from the county's Adult Protective Services Division walked in, flanked by the attorney I'd hired. Rosalind's face drained of color instantly. She turned to me, confusion curdling fast into panic, and I simply nodded to the men I'd been working with for 2 weeks. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there in that beautiful dress as the detective read her the charges: financial exploitation of a dependent adult, elder and disabled adult abuse, and the theft of settlement funds belonging to her own brother. Her mother of the bride sat frozen in the front row, and the whole room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the orchestra's cellist still holding his bow against the strings, forgetting to move. They led her out past the abandoned wedding cake and the wilting centerpieces, her train dragging behind her like something already dead. I watched the door close behind her, and I felt no triumph, only a hollow, exhausted relief, the same feeling I used to get closing out a case file after years of digging. I turned away from that door and found Danny waiting for me in the back of the room, in the wheelchair I'd arranged to have brought that morning, wearing a borrowed suit jacket that hung a little loose on his thin shoulders. I walked over, knelt down beside him, and told him he never had to be afraid of being forgotten again. I told him his sister could no longer touch a cent of what belonged to him. That same afternoon, I sat down with the elder abuse attorney and Danny's new court-appointed guardian and set up an irrevocable trust, funded generously from my own retirement savings, alongside the recovered settlement money, with a neutral third-party trustee to manage everything for the rest of Danny's life. No one, not Rosalind, not any future predator wearing a warm smile, would ever be able to touch it. Over the following month, I paid to move Danny into a newer facility closer to my own home, one with an art studio and better rehabilitation equipment, so I could visit him myself every single week the way family is supposed to. I was in my living room the day Danny came over for Sunday dinner for the first time, wheeling himself through my front door with a grin that reached all the way up into his eyes. The house smelled like the roast I'd put in that morning, and for the first time in 8 years, it didn't feel too quiet. Danny gripped my hand hard with his good one and told me I was more of a brother to him in 3 months than his own flesh and blood had been in 3 decades. I told him that's exactly what family is supposed to look like, showing up, plain and simple, week after week. My truck sat in the driveway when I got home that evening, the same reliable one that had carried me down that gravel road toward Willowbrook, and I sat in my favorite chair by the window, coffee in hand, looking out at my quiet street. I was alone again, but for the first time in a long while, that word didn't feel heavy at all. I'd spent 38 years learning to read a lie hidden inside a story, and it had finally saved someone who actually deserved saving. The hardest lesson this whole ordeal taught me is that charm and grief can be worn like a costume, and the people most capable of breaking your heart are usually the ones who've studied exactly which strings to pull. Real wealth was never sitting in that joint account or hanging on a designer gown. Real wealth is a disabled man's laugh echoing through your kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, knowing you were the one who finally showed up for him. Protecting the people you love means asking the uncomfortable questions, even when someone begs you not to, especially when they beg you not to. Tell me down in the comments, folks, if you've ever trusted your gut over someone's tears, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.